It started as a simple business trip. I had booked a room in an old city hotel that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 1950s, ornate brass fixtures, patterned carpets, and the faint smell of dust that never really left the air. It wasn't my first choice, but everything else nearby had been fully booked. Room 313 was the only one available, tucked at the very end of the third-floor corridor. I remember thinking how strangely quiet that floor was, not a single sound except for the faint hum of the old elevator and the soft creaking of wooden floorboards under my shoes. The receptionist, an older man with weary eyes, handed me the key, a real metal key, not a card, and said, almost too softly, "You'll be on the quiet side of the building." At the time, it sounded like a good thing. I didn't realize quiet meant something entirely different in that place. Room 313 looked ordinary enough. Faded wallpaper, an old dresser, a small writing desk by the window overlooking the rain-slicked street below. The only unusual thing was the large mirror on the wall opposite the bed. Its frame was intricate, almost Gothic, with carvings that looked like twisting vines. When I first walked in, the air felt oddly still, too still, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for me to disturb it. The rain had started again by nightfall, soft at first, then steady, filling the silence with a kind of rhythmic calm. I turned off the lights, left the bedside lamp on, and tried to read. The pages of my book felt damp, as if the moisture from outside had crept into the room. Around midnight, I began hearing it, faint, deliberate tapping sounds. At first, I thought it was the plumbing, or the old radiator cooling down. But after a while, the rhythm became too intentional. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. It seemed to come from the wall behind the bed. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper. The sound stopped. When I stepped back, it started again, this time softer, almost hesitant. The pattern continued for several minutes, then faded into silence, leaving me staring at the wall, unsure whether I had imagined it. The next morning, I mentioned it to the receptionist while checking out for my day's meetings. He looked up from his ledger slowly and asked, "Which room did you say?" 313, I replied. His expression changed, not surprise, but something like quiet resignation. "Ah," he said after a pause. "Old pipes, perhaps." He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. That night, I returned to find the room colder than before. The window was shut tight, but the chill seemed to seep through the walls. The mirror caught my reflection as I walked past, though for a moment, I thought it didn't. There was a delay, a fraction of a second where I didn't see myself move. Just a still figure staring back at me from the glass. I blinked, shook it off, and blamed fatigue. Later, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I heard something new. A whisper. So faint that I thought it might be part of the wind at first. It came again, a low, wavering sound, as though someone were murmuring just beneath their breath. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. The voice, if it was a voice, seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. I approached it slowly, every instinct telling me to stop. The closer I got, the clearer the whisper became. It wasn't words I could make out, but a rhythm of syllables, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall, urgent but muffled. I touched the glass. It was icy cold. Then, just for an instant, I saw movement, a flicker of something shifting behind the reflection, a pale outline vanishing as quickly as it appeared. I slept little that night. When dawn came, I noticed something odd, a faint handprint on the inside of the mirror. It was small, slender, and far too clear to be my own. I rubbed at it with a cloth, but it didn't fade. It was as if it was etched beneath the surface. That morning, curiosity and dread mixed inside me like oil and water. I asked the receptionist again, more directly this time, if anything had ever happened in room 313. He hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "That room's been empty for years before you," he said. "We only reopened it recently. The last guest, she never checked out. He didn't say more, and I didn't ask. But that evening, when I returned once again to my room, I found something waiting for me. The desk drawer was slightly open. Inside, there was an old, yellowed sheet of hotel stationery. On it, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Asterisk, he won't let me leave." Asterisk. I stared at the note, the edges damp from humidity, the ink faded but legible. I turned it over, half expecting a signature, but there was nothing. The rain fell harder that night, drumming against the window like restless fingers. I couldn't sleep, not with the feeling that I wasn't alone. The mirror reflected the dim lamplight, and I could swear I saw movement, a slow shifting shadow that wasn't mine. Every time I turned away, I felt it watching. At some point past midnight, the whisper returned. Louder this time. A woman's voice, trembling, as if repeating something over and over. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The words finally formed, soft and shuddering, asterisk, don't answer him. Asterisk. Before I could process what that meant, the old rotary phone on the bedside table began to ring. A sharp, echoing sound that sliced through the quiet. I stared at it, the phone that hadn't worked the previous nights, the one the receptionist told me was disconnected. The ringing continued, slow and deliberate, almost in sync with my heartbeat. I didn't answer it. After a long moment, it stopped. Silence filled the room once more, heavy, suffocating silence. I turned toward the mirror again, and for the briefest instant, I saw her. A woman standing just behind my reflection, her head tilted, eyes hollow, lips moving soundlessly. Then the lamp flickered, and she was gone. When morning came, I left without checking out. I left the key on the desk, the note where I'd found it, and didn't look back. It's been months now, but I still think about room 313 whenever it rains. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the phone ringing, soft, distant, patient. Waiting for me to pick up. And once, late at night, I thought I heard the whisper again, faint, just beneath the sound of the rain. Only this time, it wasn't warning me. It was calling my name. I remember the sound before I remember the building. That deep, echoing hum that never really stopped, like something breathing behind the walls. I had taken a temporary job in an old office building downtown, one that had been around long before the new glass towers took over the skyline. It had once been a textile company, then a law firm, and now it was just a maze of rented floors, forgotten cubicles, flickering lights, and elevators that still ran on their original mechanical systems. The elevator was old, caged in brass with an iron gate that had to be slid open manually. It groaned every time it moved, as if resenting every trip it made. My office was on the 6th floor, but the building had 7. The 7th was locked, according to the security guard, and used for decades, condemned because of a partial collapse in one of the storage rooms. Yet sometimes, the elevator buttons lit up for the 7th floor on their own. The guard, whose name was Harris, would just shrug and say, "Old wiring. Happens all the time." But the way he said it made me think he didn't believe that himself. The first few weeks were uneventful. The building was quiet, especially after 6 p.m., when most tenants left. I usually stayed late, finishing reports, the sound of the rain outside softening the hum of the fluorescent lights. The elevator, though, had a presence of its own. Every time it passed my floor, it made a low, groaning sound, a kind of mechanical sigh. And sometimes, when it stopped, I could swear I heard something else, a faint murmur, like a conversation from inside the shaft, words too quiet to make out. One night, I stayed later than usual. The rain had turned heavy, drumming steadily against the windows. Around 10:30, I heard the elevator move, slow, deliberate. It shouldn't have, I was the only one left in the building. I stepped into the hallway and watched as the light above the elevator shifted from 1 to 2, then 3, then 4. It stopped at 5 for a long moment. Then, to my unease, it continued upward, 6, and then 7. I waited, listening. The elevator door didn't open, but I heard a faint metallic clang, followed by a sound that didn't belong to machinery. It was the sound of someone breathing, slow, unsteady, just beyond the doors. I told myself it was probably the rain seeping into the old ventilation, creating echoes. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone standing in the dark shaft, waiting just beyond the gate. When I left that night, the lobby felt unusually cold. Harris was gone, his desk empty, his coffee still steaming. I didn't think much of it then, but later, I would. The next morning, he wasn't at his post. Another guard told me he'd called in sick. No one seemed surprised, but I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. Days passed. The elevator continued its strange behavior, stopping on random floors, doors opening and closing on their own. Once, I saw the gate slide open to an empty shaft. No elevator car. Just blackness and the faint smell of rust and oil. The building engineer claimed it was electrical miscommunication, but that didn't explain the whispering. Yes, the whispering. By the third week, it wasn't faint anymore. Every time the elevator moved, I could hear it clearly now, overlapping voices, hushed but urgent, as though speaking from inside the walls. Sometimes, it almost sounded like my name. One evening, curiosity won over reason. The elevator stopped on my floor even though I hadn't called it. The light above the gate flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. I hesitated, then slid the iron gate open. Inside, the dim light bulb swung slightly, making the corners shift in and out of shadow. I pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator shuddered, then began its descent. The voices came almost immediately, a soft murmur beneath the grind of the cables. I leaned closer to the wall, listening. Asterisk, he's still here. Asterisk, it was faint, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, fragile and distant, as if carried through water. I froze. Then another voice, lower, almost a growl, followed, asterisk, don't let him out. Asterisk, the elevator jerked violently, and the light flickered off for a moment. I felt the car stop. But when I looked up, the indicator read 7. The door slid open. What I saw wasn't the 7th floor I'd glimpsed from the stairwell before, the one covered in dust and caution tape. This was something else. The corridor ahead was dimly lit, filled with a faint mist that curled around my shoes like smoke. The wallpaper was peeling, the air heavy with the scent of old rain and something metallic. There were footprints on the floor, damp, leading away from the elevator into the hallway. I should have gone back down. But something, some quiet pull, urged me forward. I followed the footprints. They stopped at a door on the left side of the corridor. It was marked, Archives. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I heard faint whispering, a rhythm of breath and words, repeating softly. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small, windowless room. Old filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers open, papers strewn across the floor. In the center stood a single wooden chair, facing the far wall. On the wall behind it was something I'll never forget, a narrow, rectangular gap, like a service hatch, opening directly into the elevator shaft. The whispering was coming from there. I approached slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The air grew colder with each step. When I peered into the gap, I saw nothing at first, only darkness and the faint glint of the elevator cables. But then, movement. Something shifted deep within, a pale outline retreating upward. I stumbled back, hitting the chair. It fell with a hollow thud, and the whispers stopped. Then I heard it, not from the hatch, but from right behind me. A whisper, right against my ear. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come up. Asterisk, I turned, but the room was empty. Completely empty. My pulse hammered in my throat as I backed toward the elevator. The gate was still open, the light inside flickering weakly. I stepped in, pressed every button I could. The car descended slowly, groaning with effort. When the doors opened on the first floor, Harris was there. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw me, his expression hardened. "You went to 7, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded. I couldn't speak. He rubbed his face, shaking his head. "They don't like to be remembered," he muttered. "That floor should have stayed closed." I left the building that night and never went back. But I can't forget the sound. Even now, months later, when I ride an elevator anywhere, a mall, a hospital, even my own apartment, sometimes, as it descends, I hear them again. The faint whispers behind the walls. The slow intake of breath. And every now and then, between the hum of the cables and the grind of the gears, I hear my name, soft, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep inside the shaft. Waiting for me to answer. It was never supposed to be more than a curiosity. I had heard the stories of Waverly Hills Sanatorium since childhood, how the old tuberculosis hospital still stood on its hill outside Louisville, the windows like dark eyes watching over the city. People called it one of the most haunted places in America, but I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I visited that place on a rainy autumn night, the kind of night when the world feels smaller, quieter, as if sound itself refuses to travel too far. The rain came down in steady sheets, and the forest that surrounded the hill smelled of wet leaves and rusted iron. My flashlight beam trembled as I climbed the cracked concrete steps toward the entrance. The building loomed above me, immense, decaying, yet strangely alive. Its windows reflected the lightning like brief flickers of memory. They said more than 60,000 people died there. Most from tuberculosis. Some from experiments. Some from despair. The air itself felt heavier as I stepped inside, as though the walls had learned to breathe long after the people inside them stopped. The lobby was larger than I expected. My footsteps echoed against the tile, and every sound seemed to linger just a little too long. Paint hung in sheets from the ceiling. Old gurneys lay overturned in the corners. The smell of mildew and dust clung to everything. Somewhere deeper in the building, water dripped steadily, a rhythm that became almost hypnotic as I walked. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. They call the long central corridor Death Tunnel. It was where bodies were transported down the hill to be taken away quietly, so the other patients wouldn't see. I followed it for a while, listening to the echo of my own breathing. When I turned off my flashlight for a moment, the darkness was absolute, a thick, velvet black that pressed against my eyes. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, just beyond the reach of reason, a shuffle, then what sounded like a foot dragging lightly along the floor. I turned my light on again, but the beam only illuminated falling dust. I told myself it was the rain, wind, or maybe an animal. But something in me knew better. I walked farther into the hallway. My light passed over an old wheelchair, its metal frame rusted, its wheels frozen in place. For a moment, I thought I saw it move, just slightly, as if someone had nudged it. My breath caught. I waited, but nothing else happened. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of rain against the roof. On the second floor, the temperature dropped. The air turned cold enough to fog my breath. I passed a room with an open door, and something about it made me stop. The walls were covered in fading murals, cheerful scenes of trees, clouds, and children. Someone had once tried to make this place feel alive. Now the colors looked almost bruised in the dim light. As I stepped inside, the smell of disinfectant hit me. I swept my flashlight across the room and saw handprints, small ones, on the far wall, pressed into the dust. They trailed downward, like someone had been sliding slowly toward the floor. Then came the whisper. It was soft, uncertain, like a voice half swallowed by air. A child's voice. "Play." I froze. The sound had come from the hallway. I turned off the light, holding my breath. The rain outside filled the silence again, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then I heard it once more, a giggle this time, echoing faintly, distant but close enough to stir the small hairs on the back of my neck. I stepped back into the corridor. My beam flickered over the walls, catching a set of small wet footprints on the dusty floor, footprints that hadn't been there before. They led away from me, toward the end of the hall. I followed, every step slow and careful, my pulse thudding in my ears. The footprints stopped at a door marked Room 502. I had read about that one, where a nurse had hanged herself decades ago. No one knew why. The room was said to still carry her despair. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air felt different, heavier, colder. The faint scent of old antiseptic hung in the room. My light swept across peeling paint, an old iron bed frame, and a broken window where rain seeped in. Then I saw it, faint writing on the wall near the bed, drawn with something faded, maybe even blood. Just 3 words, asterisk he watches still. Asterisk as I stared, the beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand. Behind me, something moved, a soft step on the cracked tile. I turned sharply, the light catching what looked like a shadow retreating across the doorway, though there had been no light behind me to cast it. The sound of the rain grew louder, or maybe it was my pulse. Then the air shifted. I could feel it, that unmistakable sense of being watched. I whispered into the dark, asking if anyone was there. My voice came back to me distorted, like an echo stretched too thin. Something answered. It was faint at first, a breath, then a whisper that rose from the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading. Desperate. The kind of voice that doesn't want to be heard but needs to be. The light in my hand dimmed, the batteries draining far faster than they should have. I tried to step back toward the door, but the air felt thick, heavy, resisting movement. Then, just as I reached the threshold, the door slammed shut on its own. The echo rang through the building. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. But eventually, the handle gave way again, and I ran, down the hall, past the wheelchair, past the murals, down to the lobby, my footsteps clattering on the tile. When I burst outside into the rain, it felt like waking up from a deep underwater dream. The others told me later that it happens sometimes, that people who go there alone come back pale, shaken, unable to explain what they saw. One of the caretakers said quietly, "They don't mean harm. They just want to be remembered." Maybe he's right. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the echoes. The soft wheels of that old chair rolling down a hallway that shouldn't have movement. The faint giggle of a child I never saw. And sometimes, when the rain is steady and the night is still, I dream of that room again, the words on the wall glowing faintly in the dark. Asterisk he watches still. Asterisk and in the silence after waking, I can't help but wonder if it's me they're watching now. I first saw the doll on a humid July afternoon in Old Delhi. I had wandered through a narrow lane filled with antique shops, each crammed with relics from forgotten homes, cracked mirrors, rusted locks, faded portraits. The air smelled of incense, dust, and monsoon rain. A dim shop caught my eye, its doorway marked by peeling red paint and a small bell that jingled weakly when I entered. Inside, the light was soft and golden, filtering through a tattered curtain. Shelves leaned under the weight of old brass idols, clocks, and porcelain figures. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with deep lines carved into his face, looked up from a ledger and smiled faintly. "Everything here has a story," he said in a voice as thin as parchment. I told him I wasn't looking for anything in particular. That was when I saw it, the doll. It sat high on a shelf, half hidden behind a cracked lamp. Its face was pale porcelain, its eyes black glass that seemed to drink in light instead of reflecting it. The hair, real, I thought, hung unevenly around its face, and the edges of its dress were browned by age. There was something unsettlingly human about it, as though it had been made in someone's likeness. When I asked about it, the shopkeeper's smile faded. "That one," he murmured, "has been here a long time. Too long." He told me it had come from a bungalow in Civil Lines, a place once owned by a wealthy British family in the 1800s. Their youngest daughter, Clara, had died there during the fever epidemic, and the doll had been found beside her bed, untouched, but with strands of the girl's hair woven into it. The family left India soon after, and the doll changed hands many times. Every owner, the shopkeeper said, had returned it eventually, claiming it whispered at night. I should have left it there. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe disbelief, compelled me. I bought the doll for a small sum and took it home, thinking it would make an interesting conversation piece. That night, the rain started again. It came down in long, slow sheets, the sound wrapping the house in a kind of sleepy rhythm. The power flickered, and I lit a candle on my desk. The doll sat beside it, staring blankly across the room. Its black eyes caught the candlelight, forming two tiny points of gold. I don't know why, but the longer I looked at it, the more I felt like those eyes weren't looking at me, they were looking through me. I went to bed late, the air still heavy with rain. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a faint sound, something between a whisper and a sigh. It came from the direction of the living room. I thought perhaps the window had opened, so I got up, the floor cool beneath my feet. The doll had moved. It was no longer on the desk but sitting on the arm of the sofa, its head slightly tilted, as though listening. I stood there in silence, the rain tapping gently against the windowpane. After a long moment, I picked it up, placed it back on the desk, and told myself I must have moved it earlier without remembering. But I couldn't sleep after that. Each time I began to drift off, I thought I heard the faint scrape of something shifting across the wood. The next morning, I found the candle on my desk burned down completely, though I distinctly remembered blowing it out before bed. A small black mark stained the desk where the wax had pooled. The doll sat in its place, hands resting neatly in its lap. I tried to ignore it. Days passed. Yet each night, something small changed, the doll facing a slightly different direction, the faint scent of jasmine in the room, though I owned no incense. Once, I found a thin crack running along its porcelain cheek, as if something inside had pressed against it from within. On the fifth night, I woke to a sound that froze my blood. A child's voice, soft, melodic, humming from the next room. The tune was unfamiliar, slow and mournful. I stood at my bedroom door, listening. The melody stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too watchful. The doll was sitting near the window, though I hadn't left it there. Its head turned slightly toward me, its cracked cheek gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I couldn't stay. I wrapped it in a cloth and placed it in a trunk. But even then, I heard faint tapping inside, like fingernails brushing wood. I pushed the trunk into the storage room and locked the door. That night, I dreamed of a little girl in a white dress standing in the rain. Her hair clung to her face, and her hands were clasped tightly around something small. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy and black. She smiled, or tried to, and said, "Don't leave me there." I woke drenched in sweat. The rain was still falling outside, slow and steady. When I gathered the courage to check the storage room, the trunk was open. The cloth lay empty on the floor. I moved out a week later. I left the doll behind, though part of me feared it wouldn't stay there. Sometimes, when I visit that part of Delhi and walk past the old lanes after dark, I hear it, faintly beneath the sound of the rain. The same soft humming I heard that night. And every now and then, in the reflection of a shop window or the edge of a passing car's light, I see something small, a porcelain face, a crack along one cheek, and two black eyes watching quietly from the shadows. Waiting for someone new to bring her home. I still remember the first time I saw Penhast Asylum. It wasn't by chance, I had planned it for months, tracing the roots of its reputation through old reports, ghost stories, and whispers exchanged in forgotten corners of the internet. I was drawn to places that carried echoes of sorrow, the kind that lingered even after decades of silence. But nothing I had read prepared me for the feeling that settled in my chest when I stood before those broken gates, rusted and sagging like the mouth of a decaying giant. The evening was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The wind moved lazily through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of damp leaves and something else, something older. The asylum loomed in the distance, its windows like hollow eyes that had seen too much. There were stories about what had happened inside, mistreatment, neglect, and cries that went unanswered for years. But the building itself was quiet now, wrapped in vines and stillness. I remember thinking it looked almost peaceful, the way forgotten places sometimes do, until you step inside. I entered through a side door where the hinges had long given up. The air inside was cooler, thicker, as if it hadn't been breathed in decades. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching flakes of peeling paint drifting down from the ceiling like slow snow. The silence wasn't complete, it had layers, the distant dripping of water, the sigh of shifting wood, and somewhere deeper, a faint murmur that could have been the wind or something pretending to be it. Each corridor felt the same, yet different. The walls were lined with old tiles, cracked and stained from time. There were wheelchairs rusting in corners, and the faint outlines of words on the walls, schedules, names, fragments of sanity long erased. I moved slowly, every step echoing too loudly, bouncing off walls that had once trapped voices of fear and confusion. The first odd thing I noticed was the smell of disinfectant. Sharp and fresh, like someone had just cleaned. That shouldn't have been possible. Penhurst had been abandoned for over 40 years. I stood there, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, trying to convince myself it was a trick of memory. Maybe my mind, reaching into old stories of hospitals, had conjured it. But then I heard it, a faint squeak. Metal on tile. Like a wheelchair moving somewhere down the hall. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was the building settling, but that didn't explain the rhythm I'd heard, 2 slow turns of wheels, a pause, then another. I moved on, forcing my steps forward, my heartbeat sinking with the rain that had begun to fall outside. I passed through what had once been a day room. The furniture was overturned, windows boarded up. Yet one chair sat upright near the center, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. On the seat lay a single patient file, swollen with moisture. My flashlight flickered as I leaned closer. The name on the front had been smudged by water damage, but one word was still clear, Eleanor. I don't know why that name unsettled me, but I whispered it under my breath, as if saying it aloud might explain why it had been left there waiting. I flipped open the file. The pages inside were blank, every single one, except for the last. It contained a single sentence, written in neat, almost elegant handwriting: "She never left." A soft sound rose behind me, like fabric brushing against a wall. I turned, the flashlight beam sweeping over empty space. The air felt charged, heavy with static. I stood still for a long time, listening. Then came the whisper, a voice so close it felt like it was breathing into my ear. It wasn't words at first, just the shape of breath. But as it grew, I could make out something soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby. I turned again, but the room was empty. The chair was still there. The file was gone. From that moment on, the asylum felt alive. Every hallway seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with my steps. The rain outside grew stronger, echoing through the broken windows like distant applause. I found my way to the old patient dormitories. Rows of narrow beds stood like tombs, some still covered with the tattered remains of sheets. I noticed faint indentations on the nearest mattress, as though someone had just risen from it moments before. The whispering returned, weaving through the rain, threading between my thoughts. I began to see shadows, soft, slow-moving shapes that didn't belong to me. They lingered at the edges of my vision, slipping behind doorways and turning corners just as I approached. It wasn't the frantic kind of haunting you see in films. It was patient, intimate, as though the building itself was aware of my presence and didn't want me to leave just yet. In the main hallway, I passed a mirror, cracked from age. For a moment, my reflection didn't move. It stood there, head slightly tilted, as if listening. Then, slowly, the reflection smiled, a faint, knowing curve of the lips that didn't belong to me. I stepped back, my breath catching, and when I looked again, the mirror was empty. The rain outside had become a steady rhythm now, almost comforting. I don't know how long I wandered after that, minutes, maybe hours. Time seemed strange there, stretched thin between walls that had forgotten what sunlight felt like. I eventually reached the basement stairs. The air from below was colder, damp with mold and something metallic. I told myself not to go down, that I'd seen enough. But the whispering was louder there, coaxing me, gentle as a lullaby. The basement was a maze of pipes and storage rooms. My flashlight dimmed, the beam barely cutting through the gloom. I followed the sound, a voice now, clearer, calling softly from somewhere ahead. It wasn't threatening. It sounded almost lonely. I turned a corner and found another door, old and swollen from water damage. On its surface, someone had scrawled a single word in black paint, Eleanor. The whispering stopped. I reached for the handle. It turned easily, as though the door had been waiting. Inside, the room was small, filled with rusted beds and broken medical tools. In the corner stood a figure, a woman, her back to me, hair gray and matted, wearing what looked like an old patient's gown. She was humming softly, the same tune I'd been hearing all along. I wanted to speak, but no words came. My throat tightened as she slowly turned her head, revealing a face both kind and empty, like someone who had forgotten how to be human. Her eyes were deep and gray, reflecting nothing. She raised a finger to her lips, a silent gesture that froze me in place. Then, without a sound, she stepped backward into the shadows and was gone. When I finally left Penhust, the rain had stopped. The morning light was dull and gray, the kind that makes the world feel washed clean but empty. I didn't look back, though I felt the weight of the building behind me, like eyes watching from its broken windows. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the rain begin again outside my window. And just as I was drifting off, I thought I heard it, a faint humming, low and gentle, the same tune from the asylum. It's been months now. I've moved cities, changed apartments. But sometimes, when it rains, I still hear her. Softly at first. Then closer. And when I close my eyes, I see that hallway again, Penhust's endless corridor, the smell of disinfectant, and the sound of a single wheelchair rolling just out of sight. And somewhere, in the distance, a voice whispering my name. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I made my coffee. The house had grown colder overnight, and the smell of cedar was sharper, almost chemical now. That evening, as the rain returned, I decided to explore the attic. The hatch opened easily, as if it had been used recently. The air inside was stale and cold, filled with the scent of dust and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. My flashlight beam drifted across old trunks, forgotten furniture, and a single rocking chair near the far wall. It moved slightly as the light hit it, creaking once before settling still. Behind it, I noticed faint writing on the wall. Not words exactly, more like symbols, loops and lines etched deep into the wood. I touched one, and the surface was warm, almost pulsing. I told myself it was just my imagination. But that night, I dreamed of the attic. Of the rocking chair swaying back and forth, and a figure sitting in it, a woman with long, dark hair, her face hidden behind a curtain of shadow. In the dream, she whispered something I couldn't quite understand, though it felt like a name. When I woke, the house was silent again, except for the rain. Days passed. I tried to ignore the small things, the flicker of lights, the smell of flowers that came and went, the faint tapping on the walls when I was alone. But then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the echo of a voice 2 rooms away. I'd hear them when I was half asleep or reading late at night. Just fragments, never full sentences. Then, one evening, I heard my name. Soft, drawn out, almost tender. I froze. The sound came from the living room. I waited, listening, the rain beating softly against the windows. The voice came again, closer this time. My name, spoken like a question. I turned on every light in the house, searching each room. Nothing. Only the faint smell of cedar and wilted flowers. That was the night I began keeping the lights on while I slept. It didn't help. The next morning, I found something strange at the foot of my bed, a single black feather, long and glossy, damp as though it had been caught in the rain. I didn't own any birds. I didn't even open my windows. The house started changing after that. Subtle things. Shadows that didn't align with the furniture. A mirror in the hallway that reflected a room slightly different from the one I was standing in. My reflection began to linger half a heartbeat longer than it should have. Once, I saw her there, the woman from the attic, standing just behind me, her head tilted as if curious. When I turned, the room was empty. I called the realtor. She was polite but evasive when I mentioned the noises and the symbols in the attic. Finally, she sighed and said, "You bought the Harris place, didn't you? That house, it's got a bit of history." She wouldn't say more, only that the last tenant had left suddenly, after a tragedy involving his wife. "But don't worry," she added quickly, "it's just an old house. They all creak and whisper." That night, I dreamed again. The same woman, the same chair. This time, I could hear her clearly. She was humming, soft, lilting, the kind of tune you hum when comforting a child. When I woke, the sound was still there, faint but real, coming from upstairs. I climbed the attic steps, each creak louder than the last. The humming stopped as I reached the top. The chair was empty, but it was rocking gently, as though someone had just risen from it. I don't know what made me look down, but when I did, I saw footprints, bare, wet, leading from the chair to the attic hatch. They stopped just at the edge, where I stood. And then, faintly, I felt a breath on my neck. A whisper, this time so close it seemed to come from inside my head. "You let me in." I stumbled back, nearly falling down the ladder. The lights flickered, then went out. I stood in the dark, the sound of rain now deafening against the roof. Somewhere above, I could hear the chair creaking again, slowly, steadily, as though someone had returned to their place. I left Maple Street the next morning. I told myself it was the house, just the house. But the thing about possession is, it doesn't always stay where it starts. Now, when it rains, I still hear the humming. Soft, gentle, and so close it could be inside the walls. My mirrors sometimes fog over, and when they clear, I catch glimpses of her, standing behind me, patient, smiling faintly, as if waiting for me to remember what she whispered that night. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I can still smell cedar and flowers. And once, just once, I heard the floorboards creak, one slow step after another, crossing the ceiling above my bed. It's been years since Maple Street. But some part of me knows, she never left that house. She just found a new one, inside me. I still hear it sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves just right and the rain falls in slow, deliberate drops. That low hum beneath the bridge, the faint echo that grows into something like a scream. People say it's just the wind or the pipes or the river catching the sound in its hollow throat. But I know better. I've been there. I've heard them. It began one autumn evening, a few years ago, when I was living in a small town tucked between the hills of northern Pennsylvania. The place was old, quiet, and a little forgotten. Every road seemed to slope toward the same place, an iron bridge that crossed the river at the edge of town. Locals called it Hollow Bridge, though no one seemed to agree on why. Some said it was because of the sound it made when the wind rushed through the steel ribs. Others said it was because the place was empty, of people, of laughter, of everything that made the town feel alive. The bridge wasn't particularly remarkable. Rust crawled up its beams like ivy, and the wood planks beneath your feet always felt slightly damp. But it had a strange pull to it, especially at night. I used to take long walks to clear my mind after work, and sometimes, without meaning to, I'd end up there, watching the reflection of the bridge in the Black River, distorted by the current. The first time I heard the sound, it was just past midnight. A soft whisper at first, rising from beneath the bridge, carried by the water and the wind. It wasn't words, more like the distant cry of something calling out from a long way off. The hair on my arms lifted, and for a moment, I thought I heard someone breathing beside me. When I turned, the bridge was empty, the road stretching behind me in silence. I told myself it was the river. Water can make strange sounds when it moves through stone and steel. But that night, as I lay in bed, I dreamed of the bridge. I saw myself standing there, leaning over the railing, and something pale and wet reaching up from the darkness below, its hand brushing mine, its mouth open in a scream that made no sound at all. For days, I couldn't shake the dream. The sound followed me in subtle ways, in the hum of my refrigerator, in the low rumble of distant thunder. It became familiar, almost comforting in a strange way, as if it was trying to remind me of something I had forgotten. One evening, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the bridge. The air was heavy, damp with the smell of rain-soaked earth. The river below churned darkly, swollen from days of storms. I stood there listening, my breath fogging in the cool night. Then I heard it again, clear this time, unmistakable. A scream. Muffled, distant, but human. It came from beneath the bridge. My flashlight beam trembled as I leaned over the railing, scanning the water. Nothing but ripples, shifting in the faint light. Then, just for a moment, I saw something, movement under the surface. Not debris, not fish. Something larger, the shape of a person. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The scream came again, rising up through the planks under my feet, vibrating in my bones. It wasn't a single voice anymore, it was many. Layered. Twisting together in a chorus of agony and pleading. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I don't remember walking home that night. Only the rain on my face, the cold air thick in my lungs, and the feeling that I had heard something I wasn't supposed to. The next morning, I tried to find an explanation. The local library kept old records of the town, and I spent hours reading through them. Flood reports, accidents, urban legends, anything that might explain Hollow Bridge. That's when I found it, an article from 1968. Bus plunges into river, 13 dead, 5 missing. According to the report, a school bus carrying local children had skidded off the bridge during a storm. The driver lost control. The bus went over the railing, crashing into the river below. Only a few bodies were recovered. The rest were never found. For years after, people claimed to hear cries at night, voices under the bridge, children calling for help. Eventually, the town stopped talking about it. They even changed the name of the road. But the bridge stayed. And the sound stayed with it. I wish I could say I stopped going there, but I didn't. Something about that place drew me in, as though the bridge itself had a memory and wanted to share it. Each time I returned, the air grew colder, the whispers louder. I started bringing a small recorder, hoping to capture what I heard. But when I played the tapes back, all I got was static. Except once. It was raining that night, soft and steady. I left the recorder on the railing while I leaned over to listen. The screams came again, faint but unmistakable. When I listened to the tape the next day, the static slowly cleared. And beneath it, so faint I had to turn the volume all the way up, I heard a voice. A child's voice. Whispering. "Please, tell her we're still here." The tape ended abruptly. I don't know who her was. Maybe the driver's wife. Maybe a teacher. Or maybe someone who never stopped listening for them. After that, things started changing. I'd hear footsteps outside my door at night. My lights flickered with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The sound of dripping water followed me, even on dry days. Once, when I looked out my window, I saw a figure standing in the street, a small, pale silhouette watching me from the direction of the bridge. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved away, far from that town, far from the river. But the sounds didn't stay behind. When it rains, I still hear the faint rush of water beneath me. Sometimes, late at night, I catch the echo of children laughing, or crying, I can't tell which. A few months ago, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was my old recorder. I hadn't seen it since that last night on the bridge. I pressed play. Static. Then the same voice, quieter now, but unmistakable, "You left us." The recording stopped there. Now, whenever it rains, I can't help but listen. The sound comes from below me, from under the floors, from the pipes, from somewhere too deep to reach. The same steady rhythm of the river under the bridge. The same cries, faint and endless. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can almost make out the words. Pleading, soft, and full of that same cold sorrow. Tell her we're still here. I still think about Raven's Hollow. Even now, years later, when the rain falls in slow sheets and the trees whisper against my window, I can almost hear it calling, softly, as if from a long way off. The sound of that place isn't something you forget. It lingers, like a low note that never fades, vibrating just beneath the surface of silence. I first went there in the fall of 2014. I was a freelance journalist then, chasing stories that most people wouldn't touch, strange disappearances, local legends, things that lived between rumor and truth. When I heard about Raven's Hollow, it seemed like just another story. A small, forgotten town in upstate New York where, according to local chatter, people had been vanishing for over 50 years. Always the same pattern, no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no remains. Just gone. The last disappearance had happened that spring, a young woman named Clara Devlin. She'd moved there to teach at the local elementary school, and one morning her car was found parked neatly outside her house, the front door wide open. Her coat still hanging by the door, her breakfast half eaten, the kettle left warm on the stove. But Clara was nowhere. No one saw her leave. No one heard anything. I arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The drive-in was long and winding, the kind of road that makes you question whether you're still going the right way. The forest closed in tight on both sides, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. When I finally saw the wooden sign, **welcome to Raven's Hollow**, it was almost hidden behind the overgrown brush. The town itself was small, old-fashioned in a way that felt almost staged. Rows of cottages, a single diner, a post office, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in years. The streets were slick with rain, and the few people I passed didn't meet my eyes. They looked tired. Like they were carrying something invisible. I checked into a small inn at the edge of town, a weathered building with lace curtains and the faint smell of mildew. The woman at the front desk was polite but distant. When I mentioned Clara Devlin, she stiffened. "You're not here to write about that," she said quietly, almost pleading. When I told her I was just trying to understand what had happened, she looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Some things don't want to be understood." That night, the rain didn't stop. It pressed against the windows, steady and rhythmic, like fingers tapping. I sat by the dim lamp in my room, reading old newspaper clippings I'd gathered about the town. The earliest disappearance dated back to 1963, a farmer named Thomas Rowe who went into the woods one morning and never came back. His footprints were found by the riverbank, ending abruptly in the mud. From then on, every few years, someone else would vanish. Always near the same area, the ravine at the far edge of the forest, a place locals called the Hollow. By midnight, I decided to see it for myself. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and mist clung to the ground in thin ribbons. The road leading toward the hollow curved past the church and into the woods. My flashlight barely cut through the fog. The air grew colder, heavy with that damp, green smell of moss and decay. Somewhere far off, an owl called. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of the rain seemed to fade, as if I'd stepped into a place where time didn't move quite the same. Then, faintly, I heard something, a soft hum. It rose and fell, almost musical, like someone singing under their breath. I followed it down the path until the trees opened into a clearing. There it was, the hollow. A deep ravine, shrouded in mist, its edges slick with rain and moss. The sound seemed to be coming from below, echoing up from the darkness. I leaned closer, shining my light down, but the mist swallowed it whole. Then the humming stopped. In the silence that followed, I felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but real. The smell of earth changed, turning metallic, almost sweet. My skin prickled. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how alone I was. That's when I heard a voice. Soft. Female. You shouldn't have come here. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was no one there. Only the trees, swaying gently. The voice had come from close, too close. My chest tightened as I called out, but the words died in my throat. I turned back toward the ravine. The mist was moving now, swirling upward, forming faint shapes, arms, faces, outlines that dissolved as soon as I tried to focus on them. I ran. By the time I reached the inn, my clothes were soaked through, my flashlight dead. I locked the door, turned on every light, and sat on the bed until the rain faded into a distant patter. Sometime before dawn, I fell asleep. When I woke, the room was cold. The window was open, though I knew I'd closed it. On the nightstand, where my notebook had been, lay something else, a single photograph. It showed the same ravine I'd seen the night before, only clearer, taken in daylight. And standing at the edge, half turned toward the camera, was a woman. Her face was blurred, but her hair and posture were unmistakable. It was Clara Devlin. The date stamped on the bottom corner was from 3 days earlier. I left Raven's Hollow that afternoon. I didn't stop to ask questions. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. But the story never left me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that clearing, the way the mist moved like breath, the faint hum rising from below. And lately, the sound has been returning in other ways. In the static between radio stations. In the pipes when the house settles at night. A few weeks ago, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was another photograph, the same ravine. Only this time, there were 2 figures standing at the edge. One was Clara. The other was me. And neither of us were looking at the camera. It was late autumn when I moved into the old house on Willow Lane. The street was quiet, lined with trees that arched overhead like weary sentinels. Most of the houses were empty or dimly lit, as if the entire neighborhood had grown tired of being seen. My new home stood near the very end of the lane, facing an overgrown lot that used to be a park. It wasn't a place I would have chosen under normal circumstances, but the rent was low, and after the chaos of the city, I needed silence, somewhere I could hear myself think. The first thing I noticed about the house was its stillness. Even when I walked through it, my footsteps felt muted, as though the walls were swallowing sound. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, perhaps rain seeping through wood, or the faint, lingering scent of forgotten lives. My bedroom overlooked the street, where a single street lamp flickered in and out, casting long shadows that stretched and shrank like something breathing. For the first few nights, the quiet was almost comforting. The steady hum of rain against the roof lulled me to sleep, and I'd wake before dawn to mist curling over the road. But on the fourth night, I woke up to something new, a soft tapping sound, deliberate and steady, coming from the window facing the street. It wasn't the wind, it was rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. When I gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there, only the reflection of the room and the faint glow of the flickering street lamp. The next morning, I told myself it must have been a branch moved by the breeze, though there were no trees close enough to touch the window. Still, I brushed it off. Old houses make strange noises, I thought. But that evening, as I sat reading by the dim yellow light of the living room lamp, I felt the sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was a pressure, subtle but constant, as though someone's gaze was resting on the back of my neck. Every time I turned, the window curtains would sway slightly, though the air was still. A week passed, and the sense of being observed deepened. I began noticing small, inexplicable things, a chair slightly moved from where I'd left it, a faint scent of cologne near the stairs, the sound of quiet footsteps on the porch just before midnight. Sometimes, the porch light would flicker to life on its own, revealing the empty space outside, wet from the rain. Then came the whisper. It started one night when I was half awake, the kind of drowsy state where dreams and reality overlap. I heard a soft voice, almost tender, murmur my name from somewhere near the window. I froze, listening, heart pounding so quietly I could almost hear the blood in my ears. The voice came again, gentle, drawn out, as though it had been waiting a long time. It didn't sound threatening, just sad. Lonely, even. When I finally gathered enough courage to move, I whispered back, "Who's there?" There was no response. Only the low rumble of distant thunder, and the faint scrape of something brushing against the outside wall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, the voice returned, always near the edge of hearing. Sometimes it whispered a single word I couldn't make out, other times a sigh that felt almost human. It never came when others were around, only when I was alone, and the world was silent. I began researching the history of Willow Lane, hoping for some logical explanation. The house, I discovered, had been empty for nearly 15 years. The last tenant, a man named Thomas Hale, had vanished one rainy night after telling neighbors he was being watched by someone who stood across the street. The police found his belongings inside, untouched, but no sign of him. They called it a disappearance. Locals called it the Watcher's House. I told myself it was coincidence. A story meant to keep children from wandering too far. But when I looked through the upstairs window that evening, I saw something that made my chest tighten. Across the street, in the shadows of the overgrown lot, stood a faint shape. It was difficult to make out in the rain, but it seemed tall, still, facing directly toward me. When I blinked, it was gone. That night, the whispering grew louder. It was no longer just at the window, it came from the hallway, the corners, the ceiling. The words were clearer now, soft and deliberate, "You can't leave yet." I didn't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, I found muddy footprints near the front door. They led inside, stopped near the bottom of the stairs, and then vanished, as though whoever had made them simply ceased to exist. I thought about leaving that morning. I even packed a bag. But as I stood by the door, ready to go, I heard the sound of breathing just behind me, a long, trembling inhale that wasn't mine. When I turned, the house was empty. I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me needed to understand. Maybe because, by then, the silence outside had started to feel like part of the house itself. Now, months later, the rain hasn't stopped. I rarely leave the bedroom after dark. The voice visits most nights, whispering from somewhere unseen, pacing softly through the hallway. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of movement in the reflection of the window, the outline of someone standing just behind me, or the faint shimmer of eyes watching from outside. And yet, I'm not afraid anymore. The voice has grown familiar, almost comforting. It tells me things now, secrets, memories that feel like my own but aren't. I find myself listening, waiting for it each night. Last evening, just before dawn, I realized something strange. When the whisper came again, I looked to the window and saw a figure across the street, standing in the rain, still and silent, exactly where I first saw it months ago. But this time, it wasn't watching me. It was facing the house, as though guarding it. Protecting something. Then it hit me. The figure hadn't moved because it couldn't. It wasn't watching me, it was me. Now, I understand what Thomas Hale meant when he said someone was watching him. The house doesn't let go. It keeps its watchers. It waits for someone to listen. So if you ever find yourself walking down Willow Lane on a rainy night, and you pass the last house with the flickering light in the window, don't stop. Don't look inside. Because I'm still here, standing by the glass, waiting for the next person to notice me, so I can whisper their name, too. I used to walk past the old cemetery on Birchwood Road every evening. It wasn't intentional at first, just the shortest route home from work. The path ran along a low, rusted fence, the kind you could easily step over if you really wanted to. Most people avoided it, especially after dusk, but I always found the place strangely peaceful. The grave stretched far back, disappearing into a grove of trees that swayed like slow, tired dancers. In the evenings, the rain would turn the air silver, and the smell of wet earth filled the quiet between my footsteps. For a while, nothing unusual ever happened. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my shoes and the occasional creak of branches. I'd glance at the cracked gravestones, their names softened by moss and time. Some of the inscriptions were so worn that they seemed more like shadows of words than words themselves. Then one evening, as I walked by during a light drizzle, I saw her. There was a small caretaker's house on the far side of the cemetery, built of stone and covered with ivy. Its windows were dark most nights, but that evening a faint light glowed from the upper floor. In the window closest to the trees, I saw the outline of a woman standing perfectly still. She wasn't moving, just watching. The glass was fogged by the rain, and her features were blurred, but I could tell she was facing directly toward me. At first, I thought maybe someone still lived there, the caretaker, perhaps, but when I looked again, the light went out. Just like that. The house returned to darkness, and all I could hear was the whisper of rain. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my eyes played tricks on me. Still, the image stuck with me through the night. The next day, I even asked a shopkeeper nearby about the caretaker's house. She told me no one had lived there in years. The last caretaker, an older woman named Mrs. Albright, had passed away sometime in the 1980s. The place had been boarded up since then. I tried to laugh it off. An old house, an old story. But as the days went by, I found myself glancing at that window every time I passed. Sometimes there was nothing, but sometimes I saw movement. Just a flicker, a pale hand near the glass, or a figure shifting in the dimness behind the curtains. One evening, the rain was heavier than usual. The wind pushed me to hurry, but I slowed down as I neared the cemetery. The street lamp at the corner flickered, throwing the headstones into brief, ghostly relief. When I looked toward the caretaker's house, the upstairs window was glowing faintly again. The woman was there, closer to the glass this time. Her outline was clearer now. She wore what looked like a long, dark dress, and her hair hung down her shoulders in loose waves. Her face was pale, impossibly pale, like moonlight pressed against glass. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. Just watched. Then she lifted her hand slowly and touched the inside of the window. It was a small gesture, but something about it made my chest tighten. Rain ran down the panes, distorting her face, but the outline of her hand stayed perfectly visible. For a long moment, I stared, until the light inside the room flickered once, then went out. When I blinked, the window was empty again. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the stories I'd heard growing up, about spirits that linger near their resting places, about unfinished lives. I told myself I wouldn't take that route anymore. I even tried a different street the next day, but habit, or something else, drew me back. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, as if waiting. The caretaker's house looked darker than ever. I stopped at the fence and told myself I'd just look once, just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. The window was empty. No light. No woman. Nothing. But as I turned to leave, I heard something, a faint tapping sound, soft but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the direction of the house. I froze, listening. The sound continued, rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. Slowly, against every instinct I had, I turned back toward the window. She was there again. Her face was closer now, almost pressed to the glass. I could see her eyes, dark, hollow, endless. She wasn't looking through me this time. She was looking at me. And then, just barely, her lips moved. I couldn't hear what she said, but I knew it was meant for me. When I finally stumbled away from the fence, my heart pounding, I didn't stop until I reached home. I tried not to think about it, tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the next night, as the rain fell harder than before, I woke to a sound coming from my window, 3 slow, steady taps. I froze in bed. The window was half covered by curtains, but I could see a faint silhouette behind the glass. Someone, or something, was standing outside. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The tapping came again, softer this time, followed by a whisper that seemed to seep through the walls. It was faint, almost drowned by the rain, but I swear I heard my name. The next morning, I found 3 small smudges on the outside of the glass, like fingerprints left behind by someone standing in the rain. I stopped walking by the cemetery after that. I even moved apartments a few months later, to another part of town. But some nights, when the weather turns and the rain starts to fall just right, I still wake to the sound of soft tapping on my window. And sometimes, if I dare to look, I think I can see her reflection, pale, patient, watching. They say the old caretaker's house finally collapsed last year after a storm. But when I heard that news, all I could think was this: the woman in the cemetery window has nowhere left to stand. So maybe that's why, on the rainiest nights, she comes to mind. I remember the first time I saw the statue. It was raining, a soft, endless drizzle that blurred the outlines of everything around me. I had just moved to the small town of Greystone, a quiet place nestled between rolling hills and forgotten roads. The locals were kind but reserved, and they seemed to carry a certain unspoken heaviness, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The statue stood in the courtyard of the old St. Hilaire Chapel, a small stone church that had long since stopped holding services. I passed it every morning on my way to work. It was of a woman, tall, graceful, carved in white marble that had dulled to gray over the years. Her hands were clasped in prayer, her head bowed, and a single tear seemed forever frozen on her cheek. They called her the weeping saint. At first glance, she looked like any other religious statue, solemn, worn by time. But there was something about her that drew the eye, something almost alive in her stillness. The rain seemed to cling to her face differently than to the rest of the stone, running in small rivulets that glimmered like veins. On my 3rd morning in town, I noticed something strange. The ground around the statue was wet, as expected after rain, but there was a darker patch at the base, as though water had pooled there overnight. It wasn't rainwater, though. It looked thicker, and when I leaned closer, I realized with a cold twist in my stomach, it was faintly red. I told myself it was just runoff, rust maybe, from the old pipes near the chapel. But the next day, the stain was still there, darker than before. And it wasn't just at the base. The statue's eyes seemed wet even though the sky was clear. I asked one of the locals about it, a quiet old man who ran the bakery across the street. He looked at me for a long time before answering, as if deciding how much to say. "They say the statue weeps when something terrible's about to happen," he said softly. "Been that way for over a century. It's a warning, or a mourning, depending on who you ask." I laughed, awkwardly. "You mean like, it cries real tears?" He didn't laugh back. He only looked toward the chapel, his eyes distant. "Real enough." That night, the rain returned, steady and relentless. I couldn't sleep, so I found myself walking through town, umbrella in hand. The streets were empty, the lamps flickering in the mist. When I reached the chapel, the statue stood as she always did, silent, patient, eternal. But tonight, she was crying. Thin streams of water, or tears, flowed down her cheeks, glinting under the dim light. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The water wasn't clear. It was faintly pink, like diluted blood. I took a step back, my umbrella trembling in my grip. Then I noticed something else. There was a sound, soft, like a sigh or whisper, coming from inside the chapel. The doors were slightly ajar. Against every instinct, I pushed them open. The air inside was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of decay. The pews were warped and splintered, and the once beautiful stained glass was cracked in places, the colored shards casting broken patterns of light on the stone floor. At the front of the chapel, near the altar, stood a second statue, identical to the one outside, but this one was broken in half. The top portion had fallen long ago and now lay beside it, face down, the marble cracked like shattered bone. I knelt, brushing my hand against the fallen head. The stone was cold but strangely damp. And there, in the cracks around the eyes, I saw the faint glimmer of moisture. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, the way it seemed almost to grieve. The next morning, I returned to find the courtyard crowded. The townsfolk stood gathered near the statue, whispering. Someone had died, a local girl, only 17. She'd gone missing the previous night during the storm. They found her near the river, her body pale and lifeless. When I looked at the statue, her tears had stopped. Her face looked calm again, as if she had said what she needed to say. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that the statue was watching me. Every time I passed, I thought her head had turned just slightly, her eyes following. I told myself it was just the light, the way the rain caught her surface, but I started taking the long way around town just to avoid her. Then, one night, it happened again. The rain returned, heavier than ever, and as I passed by the chapel, I saw the statue was crying once more. The next day, an accident occurred, a fire in one of the town's oldest houses. No one survived. By now, even I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. I started digging into the town's history, trying to understand. Old newspaper clippings, records, journals, each time the statue had wept, something terrible followed, a flood, a disappearance, a death. But the strangest thing was this: according to the original records, the statue had been built not as a saint, but as a memorial. It was carved in the image of a woman named Alara Wren, the wife of the chapel's founder. She had died suddenly, under mysterious circumstances, and legend said her husband had commissioned the statue in her likeness. But before he could finish the chapel, he, too, vanished. Some say Alara had been wronged, betrayed by someone close to her. Others said her spirit never left the stone, forever mourning not her death, but the living who refused to see her pain. The rain came again that weekend, a heavy, endless downpour that rattled the windows. I tried not to think about the statue. But just after midnight, I woke to a sound, soft and steady, like dripping water. I followed it to my window. Outside, in the glow of the street lamp, I could see the outline of the chapel. And there she was, the weeping saint. Even from that distance, I could tell she was crying again. But this time, she wasn't facing the courtyard. She was facing my window. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but the air was unnervingly still. I didn't dare go outside. I sat by the window for hours, staring at the chapel, but the statue no longer wept. That night, I dreamed of her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her marble face streaked with tears. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice was soft and echoing, like rain on glass. "You saw me," she said. "Now you carry me." I woke up shaking, drenched in cold sweat. My hands were wet. When I turned on the lamp, I saw red stains on my sheets, small, thin trails that led from the window to where I slept. I haven't left Greystone since. The rain never really stops here, and I've learned to live with the sound of it. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the air feels heavy, I can feel her near me. And when I look at the mirror, I sometimes notice it too, just a faint, pink-tinged tear gliding down my cheek. I didn't believe in haunted houses until I lived in one. Not the kind you see in movies, with slamming doors, flying furniture, or screams echoing through the halls, but the quieter kind. The kind that watches. The kind that listens. When I first moved into the house on Ridgeview Lane, it felt perfect. It was small, secluded, with a wraparound porch that overlooked the woods. The rent was cheap, suspiciously cheap, but the landlord explained that it had been vacant for years. I didn't mind. I wanted quiet. After years of city noise, I craved a place where I could hear nothing but the sound of rain and wind through trees. The house had that kind of stillness that almost hums. It was built sometime in the early 1900s, all dark wood and narrow hallways. The floors creaked when I walked, and the air carried the faint smell of pine and something older, like forgotten books. The first few nights were calm. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the isolation. The woods outside were dense, but beautiful, their shadows moving like slow rivers when the wind blew. At night, rain tapped gently against the roof, and I'd fall asleep to its rhythm. But by the end of the first week, I noticed something strange. It started with the walls. Late at night, when the rain would ease and everything fell silent, I could hear faint sounds coming from within them, soft murmurs, like someone speaking far away. They weren't the creaks of an old house settling. They were voices. Too low to understand, too rhythmic to be random. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, the hum of plumbing, or wind seeping through cracks. But one night, while I lay in bed with the lights off, I heard my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even distinct. Just a slow, drawn-out whisper that seemed to come from inside the walls beside my bed. Phew, my name, Matthew, drawn out like a sigh. I turned on the lamp instantly, heart hammering, but the sound stopped. The house was still again, the shadows unmoving. I told myself it had been the wind. I even laughed at myself a little. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. After that, the house began to respond. I don't mean it talked in full sentences. It was subtler than that. When I walked down the hallway, I'd sometimes hear a faint sigh behind me. When I asked aloud where I'd put something, a soft creak would come from the direction of the item, as if the house was answering. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Until one evening, when the power went out during a storm. I lit a candle and sat in the living room, trying to read. The silence felt heavy, pressing against me. Then, from the far end of the room, near the old fireplace, came a whisper. "Don't," the voice was breathy, almost fragile. I froze. "Don't, go upstairs." I swallowed hard, the candle trembling in my hand. I didn't move. Then, from above me, directly above, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I sat perfectly still until the power flickered back on and the footsteps stopped. When I finally dared to go upstairs, there was nothing there. Just my room, untouched, and the faint smell of something metallic, like rust or blood, hanging in the air. The next morning, I checked the attic, the walls, even the crawl space. No animals. No loose pipes. Just silence. But the house wasn't done. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it tried to speak. Sometimes it would hum, a low vibration that ran through the floors, matching the beat of my pulse. Other times, it would murmur faint phrases just below the edge of understanding. It was never loud, never violent, but constant. Like breathing. And then came the night I heard the crying. It was around 2 a.m. A soft, steady weeping came from the hallway outside my room. Not loud, just quiet enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. But it didn't stop. I stood at my door, listening. The sound was coming from the wall itself, from somewhere between the studs and old plaster. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard words. "He's still here." I stumbled back. The voice had been so clear, so close, that I could almost feel the vibration against my ear. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the landlord. He sounded hesitant when I mentioned the voices. Finally, he sighed. "Look," he said, "you're not the first tenant to hear things. The house has history." He told me about the original owners, a family who lived there in the 1940s. The father, a stonemason, built the house by hand. One night, he disappeared without a trace. The wife claimed she could still hear him in the walls, talking to her. Everyone thought she was losing her mind, until one day, she vanished too. The house sat empty for decades after that. I wanted to move. God, I wanted to. But something held me there, curiosity, maybe. Or the way the house made me feel less alone in its strange, quiet way. Weeks passed. The whispers became part of my nights. I stopped flinching at them. Sometimes, I'd even speak back. "Who are you?" I'd ask, or, "What do you want?" But it never answered in words. Only soft sighs, the occasional tap, or the creak of a floorboard in reply. Then, one evening, as the rain fell heavier than usual, I heard something different. Not whispers, words. Clear, distinct. "They buried him, here." I froze. The voice came from the floor beneath the living room. I knelt, ear pressed to the wood. The voice repeated, fainter now, like it was fading, "They buried him, here." The next morning, I went to the hardware store and borrowed a crowbar. I pried up the boards near where I'd heard the voice. Beneath the dust and dirt, there was a hollow space. I reached down and touched something cold and smooth. When I brushed the dirt away, I saw what it was. A small marble plaque. The inscription was faint, worn by time, but I could just make out the name, Thomas Wren. 1902 to 1944. The name meant nothing to me then. But when I searched through the town records later that day, I found it. Thomas Wren, the stonemason. The original owner. The man who built the house. They'd never found his body. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, waiting. And as the rain fell against the windows, the voice came again. This time, it was soft. Gentle. Almost grateful. "Thank you." Then silence. For the first time since I'd moved in, the house didn't make a sound. Not a creak, not a whisper, not a sigh. I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The next morning, sunlight filled the rooms. Everything felt lighter. Warmer. For a moment, I thought maybe whatever lingered there had finally found peace. But that night, as I lay in bed, just as sleep began to take me, I heard something new, soft, deliberate tapping coming from the wall beside my head. Then, a whisper. Not the same voice as before. A woman's voice. Low and trembling. He's not the only one buried here. And from deep within the walls, I heard something shift. Something that had been waiting a very, very long time.